Folks, it's been 5 years since the first case of the COVID-19 virus that showed up in the United States. And 5 years later, the Select Subcommittee on the COVID pandemic has released its 500 plus page report. And there's some really interesting findings. In this video, we're going to focus on the effects of school closures and lockdown measures. Now, I want to leave this question for you as we begin. The first is, imagine if the decisions that were meant to protect us actually ended up doing more harm than good. In fact, that's exactly what the subcommittee has found. But before I begin, folks, I just want to, for those that are new to the channel, my name is Christopher. I'm the host of the Open Minds Show right here on YouTube, where I'm trying to interject a level of moderation back into our hyperpolarized world. So if you're liking my content, definitely hit that like button, subscribe, tell all your friends, and tell everyone that Christopher sent you here. Now, one thing that the report found was pandemic-era school closures will have an enduring impact on generations of America's children, and these closures were enabled by groups meant to serve those children. And to prove this point, folks, I just want to cast your mind back to a time when this was the norm. In fact, here's exactly what Mayor Bill de Blasio had to say about the pandemic and closures at the time.
But I can also tell you it's the right thing to do. It clearly will help us save lives because it will help us to guarantee that the strategies that have been working, the shelter in place, the social distancing, all the focused strategies that are finally beginning to bear fruit, they need the time to continue to be effective.
Now, I just wanted to pause there for a second and say this isn't supposed to be a right or left thing. Bill de Blasio echoed what many mayors and governors and premiers and others across North America were echoing at the time. And the reality is a lot of these policies were actually being made up in a way from the scientific community as we were going through the pandemic. Now, I think at the time, many moderates and moderate voices were saying school closures at a time when a child's development is so critical is a bit iffy. And I think a lot of parents were struggling with, do we protect our children or do we continue to do so respectfully for them to go to school so that they can continue to develop their minds together? So what's interesting here too is a study out of Brown University found a few things which were really interesting. It found that there was a 20 to 30% decline in literacy and math proficiency, with low-income students in particular disproportionately affected. Now, folks, I know there's a lot of confounding variables and things that can also contribute to these literacy rates that probably were in existence prior to the pandemic. But I think the point here that the Select Subcommittee was trying to raise is that the measures that were put in place exacerbated those exact issues. So while there might have been a decline in literacy rates, perhaps it was more exacerbated with the pandemic. And I can understand that. You force lockdowns, you force kids behind a computer. Most times, more times than not, they're not logging on and absorbing information in the same way that they would had they been in person. And I think looking back, it would have been more prudent for scientists, researchers, perhaps to even work with social psychologists and child psychologists about what a potential lockdown for extended periods of time would mean for children. But there's a second point to this, which is also really important. The mental health crisis that more and more young people have been facing. The CDC reported a staggering 31% increase in emergency visits for pediatric mental health crises during school closures. And the report highlights this, stating school closures significantly contributed to increased instances of mental and behavioral health issues. Now, that doesn't go without saying. You lock young people in particular down, there's a whole host of other mental, emotional, and mental health behaviors that are part of those lockdown procedures. And I think what the Select Subcommittee is trying to do is saying, during those moments where we're thinking of doing a school closure, it's important that we understand all of the ramifications this one policy will have and make sure that we're doing so in a balanced and effective way. Now, what's also interesting, and this is where the report may become very political, they talk about the American Federation of Teachers lobbying for stricter closures, even editing CDC guidance. And this is where things get political, because there are many groups that exert some political influence over decision makers, and perhaps this could have been in fact, what was happening. Now, did we take a wrong approach? Did the United States, Canada, and other countries take the wrong approach when it came to schools? Well, sadly, we may not know for many more years as these children get into adolescence and into adulthood the real long-lasting impact these lockdowns had. Although we as adults probably look at it as temporary and this was a temporary piece, the children that went through it at the time may not actually realize the trauma and the psychological impact this will have until much later on in their life. So this is something policymakers need to really think about. The second point I wanted to make was lockdowns. A lot of times lockdowns were justified by those officials saying that it was to slow the spread of COVID. But the report found something else that happened. It found that government-imposed mandatory lockdowns were the primary cause of temporary and permanent business closures. A study by the National Bureau of Economic Research found that nearly 43% of small businesses temporarily closed during the pandemic, with many never reopening. Meanwhile, major corporations thrive. Now, this is not something new. This is something that was said during the pandemic. This was something that was said while these policies were being in place. But it points to the bigger question, as I mentioned earlier, about those influential groups that had sway with government and government policymakers. But it was also interesting to see the lockdown measures on individuals. It goes without saying, anxiety, depression, stress all skyrocketed. The Kaiser Family Foundation found that these symptoms went from 11% pre-pandemic to 40% of adults during lockdowns. Enduring COVID lockdowns unnecessarily damaged Americans' mental health, as well delaying medical care, had severe impacts on Americans' physical health. A JAMA Network Open study found delayed cancer screenings and elective surgeries resulted in worsened outcomes for thousands. It also looks at what was essential versus non-essential work, something that Dr. Jay Bhattacharya has raised in the past. If you were deemed essential, typically you were from communities that you didn't have a desk job. So desk job staff could work from home and they were okay. Essential workers were those that didn't have a desk job and had to go out on the front lines, public transit workers, nurses, etc. And there was a distrust in government because suddenly essential workers were literally putting themselves and their lives on the risk during the pandemic while 9-to-5ers were working from home. And this caused and created a lot of widespread frustration. Now, the last questions I wanted to leave you with, I understand this report may by some be considered politically motivated. It's a Republican committee and they have an axe to grind against the Democrats that were in power at the time of the pandemic. But I think really it's very important for us to remember that there were many decisions that were made without enough evidence. And I think as moderates, we have to push our policymakers, push our public leaders, our chief medical health officers, our mayors, our premiers, our governors, our presidents, our prime ministers, to put in place policies that are based somewhat in rigorous analysis, especially for those that are impacting literally every single person. Lockdowns, school closures are just a couple of examples. But I'd love to know what you think. I'll leave a link below to the report. Tell me what you think in the comment section below. Do you believe what the report says? Do you agree with it? Do you think that there's more to it? Let me know what you think in the comment section below. As always, my name is Christopher, and I hope you enjoy my content. Hit that like button and definitely subscribe.